Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the transition between the early services that Nancy talked about and preschool services for children with disabilities. So we'll talk about what is the transition, how is California doing, and then some recommendations. So first, what is Part C? Well, we just heard about Part C from Nancy. These are federally mandated services through IDEA. They're birth to 3 years of age, and they're administered through the Department of Developmental Services. So here, children can be identified with a developmental delay, a disability, or an established risk condition. In California in 2016, that was only 2.9% of infants. And more than 80% of these children are served in a home context. So they're served by occupational therapists, by speech therapists, or by educators or others, but 80% in the home. What happens in Part B is that when children turn 3 at 36 months, they are now eligible for Part B services. These are what we're concerned about here are the 3 to 5-year-old services in Part B. These services are administered through the Department of Education, and here the eligibility is different. So children have to be identified with one of the 14 categories of the Department of Education. In California in 2016, that was 5.4% of preschoolers. And in contrast to Part C services, 80% of these children are served in center-based care, usually a school setting, and usually a special education school setting, in part because we don't have universal preschool, so there are very few neurotypical preschools that children can enter into. So we're concerned about how children transition from one service to the next. And we are particularly concerned because we want to make sure that all children who need services in California are indeed being identified, referred, and served. So how's California doing in this transition from Part C services to Part B? So the main takeaways are that California falls below national averages in both identifying and serving infants, toddlers, and preschoolers with developmental disabilities. We are under-identifying children in every racial ethnic category. And because of this, California is currently under federal watch for not meeting compliance guidelines. We have several barriers to improvement, which I'll talk about. One is that we have these different sectors or these different systems and different eligibility criteria. Another is that we have differences in family and staff expectations and training. And then we don't have a centralized ongoing monitoring and evaluation system. So if we just look at this table, this is from 2016, we have about 2.9% of children in California who are receiving Part C services, but this is below the national average percentage of 3.1. Another issue is that in terms of the children transitioning from C to B at age 3, is that 45% of our children are transitioning out of Part C services compared to about 16% nationally. And just 1.8% are clearly eligible for Part B services. So this seems like success, like we're doing really well in that children are transitioning out of these infancy services and not needing additional services. But the issue is that about a pretty good chunk, about 38% of children are leaving Part C services, the infant services, with undetermined eligibility. And this is much higher than what we see in the federal percentages. When we think about who's transitioning in a timely fashion to those Part B services, so right when a child turns 36 months, they should be in Part B services. But we're at about 79% compared to about 96% nationally. So we're not doing very well. And because of this, we're under federal watch for not meeting these compliance standards. So what is undetermined eligibility? So about a third of children are in this category. And this has to do with the system's eligibility. So you can be developmentally delayed in Part C, but when you get to Part B, you have to fit into one of those 14 categories. And this is a problem in that Part C services are not identifying those eligibility categories so that there's a smooth transition into Part B. And then, of course, Part B doesn't take just general developmental delay. So this can cause a delay in the transition as children will probably need assessment and referral to gain access to those Part B services. Another issue that's becoming increasingly clear is that we've had an increase in children being diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, and autism is often diagnosed just before age 3. And so a lot of times children are getting private agency services because of they can get services through their insurance. And this is often at greater hours than is being offered in their Part B services or their Part C services, either one. And so families, when they make this transition at age 3 into Part B, they may not want to access Part B services because a lot of times they're at fewer hours than what they're currently receiving. So families will often request the system, the Part B system, to continue those high intensity services. And so that's costly for Part B services, but it also can mean that families are not transitioning into Part B and using private services. For staff and families, we have a lack of trained educators to work with children with disabilities. So in 2016, about 3.4 trained special educators per 100 children served under the Part B services. So that's a problem. We also have difficulty having enough educators that are culturally and linguistically diverse to match our families. Families also feel this sort of mismatched focus between the Part B services or the Part C and Part B. So in Part C services, families get an individualized family service plan where the goals are really around the family. Versus when the child goes into the school system, it's around the children's needs. So they get an individualized education plan. So the focus here is really different. Parents can feel like they're an insider with the Part C services, with a family and IFSP, but then they feel sometimes that they have to give way to a system or give their child up to the system, and they're just not as involved in the school system. So that can be a problem. All right. So another issue is that we have, we don't actually know what we don't know because we don't have really good progress monitoring and evaluation. So it's hard to know what these different expectations are. So we don't have a standardized measure. We know that in California, kids are functioning within age expectations in Part C for about 67% of the kids, but we're substantially, not seeing an increase in this rate of growth in California. But it's hard to know what this means because we don't have meaningful outcome measures or standard outcome measures. See. Okay. So recommendations. So I think that there are several things that California can do. One is that, and Nancy had talked a little bit about this, is that we need a centralized screening and child tracking system. So if children come into the Part C services with an ID number that then stays consistent as we track them across services, whether they leave Part C and don't come into Part B, but maybe resurface later in a different system, but also for children who are going from Part C to Part B. So having one centralized ID will help us track children. We also need to have a little bit better interagency coordination, so one system of administration. And there are states that have done this. Another idea that states have done to kind of systematize the system is to only have access into Part B services a couple times during a year. So, for example, in October or February, because currently children can come in at any time whenever they turn 3. And so it can be very chaotic for the system just to keep up with that. Another issue is to have an improved workforce. So we need better training and more special educators that are trained to work with young children with disabilities. We also need a more linguistically diverse and culturally sensitive or a cultural group of teachers that can match the families that we are trying to serve. We also need to better prepare families for that transition so they understand what the expectations are when they go into the Part B services, into the school system. So starting that transition very early and making sure that all of our materials and the people presenting the material to the families are matching the families' language and cultural needs. And then finally, we need to have a data monitoring system for tracking progress. Currently, we have very little information about how well our children are doing who have disabilities as they transition into and through these different systems. Thank you.